I think that sometimes we end up in two camps, in a pro-development and an anti-development camp, in a way that's not useful, frankly. And my background in international studies definitely influenced how I address these questions.
You are listening to the Humanity in the Loop podcast.
Welcome to the Humanity in the Loop podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My guest today is Cynthia Morinville. Cynthia is a postdoctoral fellow in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. Cynthia has contributed to journals such as Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Geoforum, and Water Alternatives. Today, Cynthia and I are discussing her work examining the environmental sustainability and social costs of resource extraction in the name of green technology. Cynthia, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tim. And correction, as of yesterday, I'm an assistant professor at the University du Québec at Trois-Rivières. And so I'm still at EUC somehow, but kind of in transition at the moment.
Congratulations. And what does this
Thank
new
you.
job entail?
A lot of teaching in the coming years, which is great. I'm essentially bringing the research I've been doing at York at UQTR, which is the shorthand for l'Université du Québec à Trois-Rivières. And so I'm continuing the same work. I'll eventually be teaching courses in urban studies, economic space, and then a new course on waste management, or how do we think with waste? So that's exciting.
As you know, I am working in the environmental and urban change faculty, so I'm sorry to see you go just as we met, but congratulations.
Thank you.
The majority of your extensive academic activity involves environmental studies, but there's one certificate that jumped out at me, a certificate in communications at Université de Québec à Montréal. Why the departure?
I've always been sort of flirting with journalism. I thought as a teenager I might want to go into journalism. Before I did that, I decided to go do an undergraduate degree in international relations and in environmental studies. I wanted to know the issues before I would do some journalism on them. And so after that, I went into a certificate in communication studies. I love stories. I love hearing stories. There's something about the power of storytelling when it's well done. You get to reach people, you get to move people, and I love it as an audience member. And so I've always wanted to do that kind of work, either film or video or photography. Sorry. And after a year of communication studies, I realized that I wanted to go back to research because I wanted more time to understand these issues. There's something about the news cycle that demands quick turnaround. You have to be lucky to get to do long form journalism in this day and age, and some terrific work is coming out in that field. But I felt more comfortable taking my time and relieving that pressure to do good research. And I bring that work, that communication, media studies, that background, I bring it into my work in other ways. I work with photography. I am hoping to build an audiovisual lab at UQTR to equip students with the possibility of having their research out there in the world in multiple formats so that we can reach multiple audiences through that.
So there is from where I sit, a thread that connects the two, in that you're trying to uncover useful information, whether it's journalism or research. Mm-hmm. What drew you to the environment in particular as a subject of study?
I think I've always been interested in the environment. I grew up spending a lot of time outdoor, just here around Trois-Rivières and the bush with my parents. I grew up my grandparents had a sugar shack. That's a whole traditional family activity. I spent a lot of time outdoor, and understanding the environment was always part of who I am and how I grew up. My dad is a trained biologist. My mom works in veterinary care. And so we grew up with a lot of animals. So I'm not sure if it's them or the way they raised me, but the environment was always there. And I sort of added my own flavor to that with international studies. And I bring that into my work on environmental issues as well.
And the more you delve into it, do you become more or less hopeful?
Both. Less hopeful and this idea that I had perhaps as a teenager that we could intervene, that there were times climate change is here. The climate for the next 50 years is already determined by our past action. But knowing that makes me more hopeful in terms of, well, that's already settled, if we will. It's the climate in a much longer time frame that we should have an impact on. And it's brought me, and we can talk about that, but I've sort of I have an interest in international relations and I keep that interest alive in my work, but I've downscaled the level of my actions and I'm much more interested in local engagement and local forms of activism or climate justice.
So let's look at that a little more, because I imagine there's a lot of differences between those two. I mean, trying to influence another nation state is very different than trying to influence your local councilor or whatever. What do you see? What draws you towards the local end of the spectrum?
Yeah, I think I did work on more international issues. After my master's, I worked for a great Ottawa-based organization called Sea Change, called USC at the time, USC Canada, and we worked on seed-saving politics and in situ seed banking in 11 countries around the world. That work was developed at the international level many, many years ago and eventually brought back to Canada, which is interesting to bring an international development perspective to your own country. And I worked on the policy and coordination team at USC. And so at the time I wrote policy brief, we had many meetings at the Hill trying to influence policies. And that work is very important. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but it can get tiresome. You're only one actor in the room. Not me personally, but my colleagues would go to the FAO, to meetings of multiple parties. We've just seen COP15 in Montreal, COP27. These meetings are slow going. And I think I needed something that was I needed to see the results of what I do in more rapid ways and at the same time, I think right around that time I became an aunt and I started getting really, that actually has shaped how I think about politics and what we do. And in some ways, I think I have just as much impact saving my own seeds and teaching my nieces and nephews how to do that and how to grow food and how do we live the life we want to live here in the everyday sense. And I've sort of left the work of policy advocacy for policies to other folks who perhaps derive a sense of realization from it that I don't. And so I went back into research. Research and policy are always connected. You can never leave it. But yeah.
And you mentioned seed banks. Is this food seeds or biodiversity seeds? What are we trying to capture there?
It's both, mostly for food. And so the idea of an in situ seed banking is it works just like a library. And so you have farmers bring in seeds at the end of the season that they have saved, and then they might take a seed loan at the beginning of the season, and they have to return it at the end. And obviously, and whatever else you grow is yours. And that local scale in situ seed banking, as opposed to an international organization like Svalbard, which is the largest seed banking up in the Arctic Circle, keeping the world's largest vault of seeds. If you grow the seed year after year, you allow it to evolve with the climate. And so if we take a seed out, so the idea of Svalbard is if you have a hurricane or a devastating natural crisis, then you could go to the bank and take out seeds that you have saved in the past. And it's that work is necessary. But if those seeds have been in the vault for several years, well, they're no longer perhaps adapted to a climate that keeps changing. And with that, you also lose the skills. In order to grow food, we have to remember how to do it. And so when we save seeds and we don't plant them year after year, what we realized, or what that research around that has realized, is that there's a big loss of ecological knowledge or know-how, that traditional knowledge that's passed down from grandparents to parents to children. You have to put your hands in the soil to keep that active. So that was the kind of programming that we did at USC.
So it sounds like the anti-Monsanto approach
Definitely.
to things.
Absolutely. Yes.
Let's turn to minerals a little bit. You've done a lot of work on lithium, and your province, the Canadian province of Quebec, has considerable lithium deposits. So there's efforts to mine it. There's efforts also to recycle it, and this is all being done. From where I sit, I'm excited about an electric economy. I think it's better than burning all the fossil fuels, but there is a hidden cost to this. What have you uncovered?
Well, these are new research for me, like compared to the work I've done on e-waste, where I spent 10 years looking at that since the early 2010s. I've been working on e-waste up until the end of my PhD. So this work on lithium is rather new. Um, what have we uncovered so far is the impact that's coming for community is large, not only for mining communities, but also there's currently a mining boom in southern Quebec and southern Ontario. There's a hype around critical minerals for the energy transition, and that energy transition is moving fast. And so I see my role in the role of this research in asking questions and not necessarily resisting or pausing the energy transition, but as we move fast as a society towards electrification, there will be some major social and economic impacts for communities, and we need to consider them ahead of time rather than um, when it's too late or when the damage has already been done.
And speaking of damage already done or thought not being given at all, you've done quite a bit of research, as you point out, into e-waste in India and Ghana. What did you uncover there?
Well, the work on e-waste really, I was interested in understanding why, after so many years of international reforms, those reforms kept failing. In some ways, the e-waste is the fastest growing stream of solid waste. If we stitch together every single piece of e-waste, it would make a mosaic larger than Manhattan.
Mm.
This is and that's only annual production of electronic waste. In terms of volume, it's above or um, of 5,300 FL towers. That's in terms of volume of electronic waste. We produce this annually, right?
Wow.
There's a lot of electronic waste, and so why are all these reforms? Why were they failing? And so a lot of work on e-waste starts from the north and traces the movement of those electronic discards to the global south, which is a more complex story, and research has shown that it moves in multiple ways, not just from north to south. But what I wanted to do, I conceived of it in the other way around. I started in those hotspots for electronic waste as they're dismantling, and I followed the value chain of those metals being recycled so I could understand the logic of that market. And what I found in doing that is that what's driving the electronic waste economy is that it's not a question of solid waste management. It's an extraction sector, and it produces a lot of minerals that are looped back into the economy. I think for coppers, the numbers we have is that it's approximately 40% of copper produced worldwide, comes from recycled or secondhand or scrap sources. And so it's a massive part of the scrap metal economy. And so we should consider it as an extractive sector. And that changes our politics and that changes our reform when we consider it as a question of extraction, the same way we might consider artisanal mining versus an approach that might consider e-waste as a problem of waste management and of regulation to limit the movement of waste in certain ways.
Okay, so that's interesting. Let me see if I can understand that. So it would be understandable if somebody said, "Oh, well, we just recycled it. It's great. There's no impact." But what I think what you're suggesting is that we need to look at the impact of recycling the same way we look at the impact of mining, which I guess would involve tailings and noxious fumes and human health issues. Is that what you're discovering, or is there more to it than that?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's part of it. But in some ways, we export waste, we export electronic waste, but other forms of waste as well, because it makes no economic sense to recycle them here in Canada. Right. The cost of labor and the regulations on environmental limits makes it economically unfeasible to recycle electronic waste in this country. And I should caveat this, we do some recycling of electronic waste, particularly at the Horn smelter in Rouyn-Noranda, but that there's no correlation between having a smelter in Canada and recycling Canadian waste. Waste moves just like any other resource, it moves internationally. And in some ways, selling it to local smelters might reduce the cost or increase the benefits for the seller. So there's an economic logic that might shorten those loops, but not necessarily. And And so when we look at the crisis of e-waste in other contexts, like Ghana, like India, we find the same economic logics. It's the same market. Copper is traded on the London Metal Exchange. It is a global fungible commodity. It does not matter where it comes from. It sells for one global price. I'm generalizing, but ultimately that's how commodities work. And so if the economy of the markets make it unprofitable in Canada to recycle electronic waste, well, it's the same economic logics and limits that make it impossible to impose more stringent labor or environmental regulation in the global south. And so when you get to the question of tailings or the environmental externalities or damage, health and environmental damages of informal electronic waste recycling, that has to do with the economy of the material. Because if you increase the cost of production or the cost of recycling in India by increasing the cost of labor or by making it more restrictive environmentally wise and imposing costs on those businesses, then it becomes suddenly economically non-attractive as a sector. And so we landfill rather than recycle.
Right, right. And is there a third way? I mean, there's an externality to throwing stuff out too.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge is that we don't apply. I mean, you use the words economic logic, and for any actor, whether it's an individual or a corporation, there's theoretically regulation. There's democratically imposed will on what they can do with their externalities or what externalities are allowed or what they cost. Is there a solution that we could impose or lobby for?
Yeah, well, the question of externalities and legislation, it works in certain settings, in certain contexts, in places where the informal economy and or the black market or the non-traditional economic sectors forms the majority, and where you have a capacity limit in terms of enforcing laws and regulation. Well, the limits of these approaches is fairly easy to grasp. Of course, there are room for certain market instrument or market mechanism that might influence that economy or the global e-waste market, if you will, or the lithium market. At the moment, recycling often costs more than searching for new raw materials. And as long as that logic is applied at the global scale, recycling will always be a sector that's sort of in stop and go. There are moments at which the markets align and create conditions in which it makes sense to recycle, but that oftentimes the recycling sector is the portion of that economy that sort of fluctuates with the inelastic productive capacity of a sector. So when mines it costs a lot of money to start and stop a mine. So that production is kind of inelastic. It does changes over time, but not quickly. So when the prices change on a day-to-day, those prices are set by the Chicago Merc Exchange, the London Metal Exchange, and then the Shanghai Exchange. So that market never sleeps. As one goes to bed, the other one wakes up. The London Metal Exchange is still where most prices are set. But if the price for copper diminish, then a mine will not stop tomorrow. But the recyclers, they can stop their activity. And
Right.
so the recycling sector at large is subject to these fluctuations. And so how we can intervene in that sector, we can do it in one of two ways, I think. And one is to do what we did with paper. And in the 80s, we decided that most of our municipal solid waste was filled with paper and that we could recycle it. And we passed legislation demanding that all paper be composed of a certain percentage of a second sourced material. And we changed the market for it. Now it's nearly impossible to find raw virgin paper and on the market. Actually, the paper, I lived in Trois-Rivières. I grew up in Trois-Rivières, so that's most of my childhood. Trois-Rivières at the time was the pulp and paper capital of the world. That industry is all nearly gone.
Mm.
Those factories have all closed down, and paper producers have moved to places like India. And if you meet paper producers in India, most of them have never seen pulp, like tree pulp. Because the entire market is secondhand paper sources now.
Hmm.
And so that market has changed. And so in certain ways, it is a success story. So we could do that, mandate a certain percentage of recycled scrap metal, if you will, or for battery maker, we could mandate you have to have 20% of your lithium that comes from recycled sources. And now I'm using this as an illustration because at the moment there's not enough lithium to recycle to put these policies in place. But then when it comes to questions like copper, lithium, metal, other metals, and rare earths, the technical difficulty is something that we have to consider. When um, when electric wires are not made of grade A copper, they're more subject to fires. They're more subject to, there is a technical issue that you might not have in paper, let's say, for safety issues. Car batteries is a key. It's easy to understand how you might want raw material, like the level of impurity has to be so small. And recycling still has some ways to go in some way to address these issues. And I'm not an engineer, and I know some great technologies are out there, but at the moment the limits are economic. It becomes so hard to ensure quality material through recycling that recycled materials are not competitive on these global markets.
So, one of the things you mentioned before we went on air is that in your research into the people involved in e-waste, you went from India to Ghana to find answers that you weren't able to find in India. Can you expand on that? What were you looking for when you went to Ghana?
Sure. Um, I could have started this research about multiple places. I started looking at electronic waste dismantlers in Hyderabad. I had colleagues working there who um, not only working there, but who had been working in that community for a long time. And I chose Hyderabad specifically because it was a small community, and I worked in a smaller neighborhood in the city, which was approximately like 1 kilometer square. And so, in a 1 kilometer square economy, it was possible for me to trace the relationships. So there's hundreds of dismantlers, but they all sell to 4 or 5 copper recyclers who then sell to 3 or 4 larger copper merchants that are located in a different portion of the city. So it's easier for me to pick at those threads. If you try to find if I had tried to do that work in Delhi, say, the market is so large, it would have been really hard to see through the overlapping threads. And so that I was able to do that work in Hyderabad. And then I followed those chains south and north, mostly to northern India through Kin Network. Metals moved to Uttar Pradesh. And at some point, I wanted to know how metals are returned on international markets. How do they move from at the end of that chain? Where do they go? And then I faced kind of two limits that's why I went back to Ghana to answer your question. One is India is a country that's importing material at the moment. The economy is in expansion, and it's so hungry for these materials that it had enough demand in country that most of these materials were not necessarily hitting the international waters. They are, and some of them are, but not in a way that made it obvious for me to find as a researcher. Access is always the question that drives where you go, essentially. Um, and then Ghana has the opposite situation. There's not many industries in Accra except steel. Steel is a booming industry, so there is a metal recycling economy. And the metal recycling economy finds multiple things, not only steel, but everything else has to leave because there is no local facilities. So I had done previous work in Ghana for my master's, and I knew there were metal exporters based at the port, and I knew they were foreign operations, and so I knew they were exporting on international markets, most likely. And so I went back, knowing I would be able to enter the world of exporters, and I spent 3 more months in the summer of 2019 in Accra and sort of doing an ethnography of export. And that was most illuminating.
So, okay, so that's interesting. So it let you close the loop in terms of if we're, what is the term, exogenous or whatever, but like it gets exported from Ghana, and so you're able to follow that thread even further.
Mm-hmm.
What is instructive about where that thread goes?
Well, I wanted to understand how the logic of these international markets, how do they touch ground, and how do they dictate or influence day-to-day activities. So in some ways, I found in Accra similar things that I found in Hyderabad and in Delhi and Mumbai and Moradabad in India. And to give you an example, in Hyderabad, the traders will wait till mid-afternoon in order before most of them will set their trades for the day because London wakes up and it's about 2 p.m. in India and prices are set for the day. And then that's when business starts. So they will have been dismantling through the morning, assembling their cargoes, assembling their stock, but then they'll wait for price signals. And so those markets, they touch the ground in very material way. And in Accra, I found something similar where when the price fluctuates, most of that economy is sponsored on cash advances. So if people don't have enough cash to accumulate waste in a way that makes it worthwhile for their activity on a day-to-day basis. So if I'm an exporter of material, I will, through trusted networks, I will inject cash in the economy. And then in a couple of days, I'll get material come back to my factory. So it's a system of advance that's mostly lubricating that market. But then when the price crashes and you have given cash out at a certain rate because you've promised on that rate how much material you've demanded how much material the recycler or the picker has to bring back to you, then you need to adjust quickly. And so there's a whole system and a chain of that sort of sets in motion, and then material kind of trickles back to your craw. And those network, and this is not my own research, but those networks have been shown to go through sort of mostly Muslim networks, all the way up to Burkina Faso and neighboring countries. Those patterns and circuits are large and far ranging. So when the call comes that you need to have the waste trickle back, there's sort of a rush. It changes. People might sell at a loss, particularly because they don't want the market to crash even more. So they'll sell today. They don't have enough financial security to withhold that slump in the market for it to come back. If larger traders will do that, they will sit and wait for the market to recover. Other traders can't do that if they're smaller. So that's sort of what I was able to find in Accra.
Yeah, very challenging. I mean, if you think about just retail, right? You stock 6 cases of beer, you can pretty much count on selling it for that price. But if it could suddenly drastically drop, you're in constant peril.
Absolutely. And people talk about their stress, and people talk about how difficult it is to do this work and how you have to be up night and day. Those calls, especially for exporters, those calls are coming from the international market. So it respects no time zone, and you cannot wait. So you cannot miss a business deal. It takes a toll on people in a way that perhaps I not imagined. It is an extremely volatile market, and it has dramatic impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. I mean, when we think of a metals trader, we think of somebody in a BMW working in London or something, but they can afford to take a hit. They may not like it, but it means one less vacation or something. But these people, it could be one less meal.
Absolutely. And depending, you have larger traders for whom it might not mean one less meal, but you do have very small people for whom it determines if they eat today and if their children will eat today. And so I've also there's sort of a moral economy that's also in place in between larger traders and smaller traders, especially in a small community like in Agbogbloshi, which is the name of the community in Accra, or in Bolakpur, the smaller community where I worked in Hyderabad. Traders reported to me selling at a loss all the time, saying, I don't need this sale today, but I will sell so that they can eat. Talking about people who depend on their business.
So your study of waste workers involves ethnographic research. I mean, this is what you're describing. It's getting the people's stories. How is ethnographic research done, and what are its challenges?
Ethnographic research is so rich. I don't know if I could do research in any other way. Certainly I supplement the ethnographic fieldwork with interviews and document analysis, and you triangulate your information in multiple ways. But for me, that's where the richness of this experience is to get to spend time with people who will open a door to their lives and it welcome you in and will generously share their life or their work. Most of my work is regards labor, so I'm interested in their work, and people take pride in their work. That's a universal phenomenon. So it's not that hard to get people to start talking about their work, and you see how people are passionate, et cetera, et cetera. I think one of the challenges of ethnography, it's not for everyone, and you have in some, and it's particularly difficult, I would say, in the context of graduate studies, maybe in Canada or in the US, or even more so in Europe, where shorter and shorter timelines are imposed on graduate students to finish on time. And to do a good ethnography, or to produce one at least, you have to be patient. You have to be patient, and you have to trust that the information will come. And so if you have a certain amount of funding that allows you to do a certain amount of months in the field, and it can come with some anxieties of not knowing, will I have enough data coming out of this research stint to write a dissertation? Or at this point, I've been doing this. I did use ethnographic methods for my master's research. I did 17 months of ethnographic fieldwork for my PhD, spread over 2.5 years. And the more you work with the method, then the more you trust it. And now ethnographic data is everywhere. You could find some ethnographic data within 2 days, and you could find something interesting to write about. I think if your eyes and ears are open to what's coming at you, but if it can be a source of anxiety. I think in students, and I'm about to become a supervisor in the years to come, and I am cognizant of the pressure I might put on some students for whom more different forms of qualitative research might be more interesting, survey-based or interview-based, or but ethnography, there's something that it affords or allows that other methods will not give you. And it has some limits, it has some downsides. Sometimes I give conferences and people ask me, so how many women work in this market? The truth is, I don't know, because I didn't do a survey. So I can tell you approximately what people reported, what I think or what I saw, but I don't have solid numbers on that. And I made that choice. I didn't want to do a survey, but it comes at a price. It comes at a cost.
So it's struck me as you were saying that it sounds like there's a lot in common with journalism, in that you're going out in the field and really trying to find the truth on the ground. But then you said something that maybe I don't understand ethnographic research, and that is, you said that an alternative to ethnographic research is relying on interviews. So is it more about observation than interviewing? What is the difference? What defines ethnographic research?
Sure. Ethnography involves interviews. You're in constant conversation with people. So it really depends on how you define interviews, but you might, in the realm of interviews, you have more structured interviews where you might have a list of questions that you ask everybody the same. So it's a more standardized way of interviewing people, or semi-structured, where you have room for people to take the conversation where they want to go, and what you do with that data, and that's up to, there are multiple ways of working with that data, but oftentimes you'll transcribe the interview, you'll have recorded it, you'll work with a transcript, you might do some discourse analysis. This might be surprising to many people, but I recorded almost none of my interviews during my PhD. For obvious reason, working in a scrapyard makes it impossible to record. The sound quality, you can't, there's no material on your tape, you just have some whispers over the banging sound of metalwork. And so that was not possible for me. And so I relied on observations, on hanging out with people. I have a good friend who calls, jokingly, we'll refer to ethnography as deep hanging out, but I think it gives people sort of a feel for what it is. And some days I just sat there talking with traders all day, and then at some point someone comes, a trade happens, it opens the door for me to ask a question because there's something I didn't quite understand, and then information is revealed in that way. So it's really, in some ways, it's happenstance. But yeah, you interview people as the day go by, to answer your original question.
Thanks. And you said they were welcoming. Were there occasions when there was suspicion about your motives, and how did you get in front of that?
Absolutely. people are generally welcoming. Sometimes you get some pushback, and you'll get some pushback no matter what kind of research you do. So you have to, it's kind of a dance. Sometimes you go back, sometimes with time, people will let you in. And not that you should be insistent but it's kind of part of it as well to just, I showed up in this community day after day, and I had gone in 2017, and I came back a year later, and people remembered me, and you develop a relationship with them that opens the door over time to more intimate conversation or more access. And that access can also be taken away. It's consent is ongoing in this method. But yes, there is some pushback, especially with the market. It's a tight market, and competition is a source of worry for traders and dismantlers and waste pickers at all times. So there are certain segments of that economy, people had no doubt that I would never be a competition. When they're waste pickers, they know the city intimately. They don't think I'm there to steal their job.
You're not going
But
to
when
open the Morinville emporium of lithium or anything?
precisely. So no, there are parts of the value chain where it was rather easy for me to convince them I wasn't there to steal their work, or I didn't want um, to enter in that market. But there are other places where that was more difficult, especially towards the end of the value chain, where in order to have or set up an exporting business, you need massive amount of capital to do that. And so people thought I was there on record. People kept asking me, who sent you? Which is an interesting question. And so I negotiated that access over time. In some places, um, being foreigner allowed me access because being a foreigner is what guaranteed I wouldn't break into this market. I have no connections. I don't have the network that would be necessary for me to start this business. But most of my interlocutors in Accra were exporters and were equally foreigners, then that differentiation wasn't there anymore. And in that particular space, being a woman helped me getting access because it's a male dominated economy. And in some ways, people don't believe a woman could want to work in the scrap industry or could want to do this as a job. So most of the time people were not worried I wanted to start my own shop. They might have been worried I was gathering information for someone else. But in those situations, I have an online presence. I'm a researcher, and so I could direct them to credentials elsewhere that showed I had been doing research for a long time, and people let their guard down.
So you've mentioned a few sort of components to relationships with other people around surrounding identity, like I'm a foreigner or I'm a woman or whatever. One of the things I've heard you mention in a previous forum is that your identity as a French Canadian has influenced your worldview and your approach to research. Can you expand on that?
I think obviously my identity as a Quebecois or French Canadian has influenced my worldview insofar as everybody's identity influence their worldview. Our identity is determined in relation to the world, and so that applies to everyone. But in my particular experience, um, I think growing up in Quebec made me really aware of the importance of for self-determination in some ways. Those discourses were present when I was growing up, so I was made familiar with these questions early on. And then I did most of my post-secondary education in Canada, or Anglophone Canada. I studied at York for my undergraduate and UBC for a master's, and I came back to Toronto for my PhD at U of T. And so I think it's extremely formative for anyone to get to leave your community and see it from the outside. And you get to, my parcours has made me, I have been living this two solitudes that we talk about in Canada, and it influences my politics. And you get to live it on a daily basis. Living in Toronto, I listen to the French news, or I hear the echo of how certain things are lived at home. And then I am also embedded in Toronto, where I read the Toronto Star, or there's a different flavor to it. And so living and threading that politics day in, day out has been extremely formative for my personal politics, but also how I do research, and understanding that community and identity are fluid. and people might identify with a community, but might have different politics of that than that community in certain ways. And so I think it's. I'm not saying it's only me, but I think there's a tendency to want to centralize communities in a way that perhaps um, I was made familiar with or aware of at a younger age through my own personal experience.
Right. Okay. You used the word parkour earlier,
Hmm.
and of course, to my ears, it reminds me of, leaping from building to building type of thing. But I guess it's a more literal definition in French. Can you describe that? Because I think as a metaphor for life, leaping from one thing to the other, it sounds pretty exciting the way you frame it.
Hmm. I mean, I think parkour in French just means the path.
The
It's
path.
yeah, or we'll say like your educational parcours, ton parcours éducatif, or yeah, it's the path you've taken. But in some ways, yes, I think life is made of, yeah, you do jump from one thing to the next, and I've certainly done that with research projects.
Absolutely. And all the places you've worked. And again, congratulations on the new building you've leapt to.
Thank you.
So I think I've hinted at my worldview, and it can certainly be challenged. But I tend to think of capitalism as the industry, or as the engine of prosperity and abundance. But then that prosperity and abundance can be concentrated in some hands, and so democracy is necessary to impose some restrictions on that to make sure everybody gets a share of the bounty and doesn't get pushed around by money too much. So I rely on the idea of democracy and how we influence democracy as a way to counter some of the excesses of
Hmm.
capitalism. That might be a very naive worldview, but we have the lever in our hand, and we should do our best to pull it in the right direction. The problem is it's only one lever, right? That's one problem, that we only get to vote once in one jurisdiction.
Hmm.
Um, how do we push for policy and law to protect environment and people when there is just that one lever to pull?
Hmm. I think it's about part of the solution is realizing that that is one lever, but there are multiple levers. And I think on your show, you with other guests, I've listened to a couple episodes, you often talk about the power of voting with your dollar or voting with your democratic voice in elections. And these are all part of how we influence and shape our world. And I think we should get interested in politics. I get worried when I hear that, I think it's a feature of every generation. We worry that the next generation is not as interested in politics. And I mean, I teach and I'm here to tell you the kids are all right and they will do it in a different way. And we could choose to have confidence in how to do it. But I definitely encourage my students to get involved with politics. And to me, I've hinted at that a little bit before. I think local politics can be enriching, and you get to know your community. And so politics is not only at the ballots, it's also in if you show up to your municipal council, if you show up to your union meetings, and you get to influence politics at a smaller scale, but at a more regular scale throughout the year. The power of voting is difficult in countries, say, like the US, in a bipartisan country, or in a first past the post system, where the system might make one vote against their best interest or their values. Or I've heard you talk before about how competing values I might have two questions very dear to my heart that are, represented by two different parties, and or maybe my national party of allegiance has a local candidate I can't get behind. And that is a problem with our the way politics is done in Canada. And I'll leave that to people who do research in that electoral reform. That's not my expertise, but this is a very long and roundabout way of saying we should get involved with politics, but that's only one way of being involved with politics. And um, for me, I came to political economy as a frame of analysis or as an approach. Um, and we have multiple identities. And the one I try to encourage, and that's not to say that there's only one, we should pull at all these levers all at once. If you can vote with your dollar, then do it. But we have to also realize that that's a class position and privileged position to have the disposable income to be able to make consumerist choices that align with some of your values. And that's also assuming that there are alternative choices. And at the moment, in multiple ways or in multiple markets, or there aren't. And so consumers are, at the moment, if you need to buy a phone, you need to buy a phone. You can choose a different brand, but they're all essentially made the same way. They're not, it's not like there is a much better option out there from one to another. And so um, that's where, with political economy, you get to a third level or a third identity, and there might be other ones, but we get to ask questions about producing, how are things produced, and what is our role in that production, and how we might use that traditional class identity to influence politics. And that's, to me, another lever to ask, to add to your list.
Thank you. One of, they always say that the secret to a functioning democracy is an informed electorate.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it seems like one of the outcomes of research would be that. But there's I think, a fine line, or that seems like there could be a fine line between research and getting the word out there and advocacy. As an academic, where do you see your role? Like, do you see that you should be involved in advocacy, or is it a matter of just saying, here are the facts, somebody else can come to a conclusion? Where's your role in that?
I think it depends what questions you're looking at. And I'll take the two examples of my work on e-waste and the work I'm doing on lithium at the moment. And they're two different, I'm positioned very differently in both of these work. In some ways, because when I worked on e-waste, the narrative around e-waste is written by big international agencies at the moment. And there wasn't much room in the literature or in the media for small dismantlers or small. And so I was interested in doing some research that might be helpful for them to intervene in their own lives, but also to respond to these big narratives around circular economies and around the way we should manage electronic waste, and in a way that does not account for them, and in a way that actually is pushing many of them out of the market at the moment. And so I think I was perhaps in a more comfortable position to adopt what you might call a more advocacy oriented position. In my work on lithium at the moment, it's very different. It's an extremely hot topic at the moment here. I live across the St. Lawrence River from Bécancour, which I'm sure you've heard of. I grew up in Bécancour and in Trois-Rivières, sort of on both shores of the river, but it is extremely political at the moment. And in that sense, it is very important for me to keep a more neutral position at this particular moment in time as my research is being determined or outlined. But that doesn't mean I'm working on a real world issue. And so most scientists, or social scientists at least, are working on real world issues. And the outcome of real world issue research is policy recommendation. And so if you work on, I don't know, literacy and the influence of screen time on children, the outcome of that work is that you might influence policies, or that you might put some mechanism in place to address these issues. And so at the moment, I do have my feet on the ground. I talk to people, I meet people, but I don't make a choice of who I talk to. I talk to everyone. And so that's how I maintain objectivity. I will meet with the mining company, and I do meet with the communities, and I do meet with the advocacy group that are doing incredible work. And I think if you meet with them all, then it's not about you can maintain objectivity, but also still be involved and be an ally. And sometimes the question I ask might serve some of the communities, and sometimes they might be a bit upset with the conclusion of the work. And same goes for mining companies, and same goes for the government. I think if you're asking the right question, then ultimately, if it's a tense issue, you'll maneuver between these parties as the work evolves.
So one surprising element to that is if I'm reading you right, you said that you are less inclined to do advocacy locally than you are abroad. And you play a dual role, right?
Mhm.
You are a researcher in Trois-Rivières, but you're also a citizen. You
Mhm.
are directly affected by what's going on. So you kind of have to hold two thoughts in your head at one time.
Absolutely. And so that's also doing work on your own community or in your own um, city is new to me. It's new work for me. Methodologically, it's exciting. I get to think about how do you do ethnographic field work at home. It's very different than when you're quote unquote in the field and your head is in a data gathering mode. Sometimes, I mean, I have a family gathering and I could go home and write notes. And like, where do you draw the line between, because I'm infused in that community and I hear like the sentiments that people have vis-a-vis this Vallée de la Transition énergétique and that lithium development up north and or the mining claim, the mining boom that's happening here in my own quote unquote backyard. Um, and so for me as a researcher, methodologically speaking, it's a very interesting moment and I'm excited about it. But I don't think it's because I don't think I'm more comfortable doing advocacy work at the international level than at home. Although um, that maps onto what I was saying before, I don't think that's what's at play here. I think that the politics are a little more that there's higher stake at the moment, and so perhaps I'm proceeding with a little more caution than I was before, or in my previous work. Um, but also, I think it's the power dynamic. It's the power imbalances between the UN and a working cooperative in a 1 kilometer square community in Hyderabad. The the David and Goliath situation was a
Mm.
bit different in a way that made it um, proponents of the circular economy did not need me to defend or I do um, I don't only critique the circular economy discourse, but I was interested in seeing how it touches the ground and the limits of that approach in reforming the e-waste crisis. And so it made more sense for me to work with workers at the time. At the moment, the politics, the questions are different. I proceed differently.
Yeah. So thank you so much. I have one last question. This has been terrific. I'm very grateful for your time. Um, as we consider environmental issues, so this show is called Humanity in the Loop, and the premise is that we make decisions all the time that often appear to be for the greater good, but what about other people that aren't part of the greater, that aren't part of the greater majority? Who are we leaving behind? Who are we impacting? How can we make it better for everyone? But it takes a lens at human outcomes.
Mhm.
And where do you sit in terms of looking at environmental issues as, well, if it impacts a person, that's a problem. Or if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to see it or be affected by it, it doesn't matter. It doesn't need to be part of our examination. Do you view your role or your research as looking to have an outcome for the planet or for humanity or both?
I think both, but I'm a geographer, and geography is the study of human environment interaction. And sometimes, if a tree falls in the forest, as you say, then it's a consequence of human activity. Then we should study it, or perhaps it depends where it falls, and perhaps that particular environment is, important, has important cultural significance to certain populations or certain communities. Um, it depends how it comes into the fray, I think, or the frame of analysis. Um, I think what I want to say is that the you hinted at that a little bit earlier, and I know we're closing on this, but that economic development is a source of progress and of well-being, and in some ways, there will always be development. But we should be cognizant that that particular development has a tendency of having unequal impacts and of leaving people behind. And so it is important to critique it so that we can mitigate some of these impacts or unequal impacts. But um, I don't think I think that sometimes we end up in two camps, in a pro-development and an anti-development camp, in a way that's not useful, frankly. And my background in international studies definitely influence how I address these questions. in Canada or here in Quebec and at the local scale. We consume technology, we consume a whole lot of stuff, and it matters where the minerals or where the stuff is going to come from. It matters who's going to be exposed to that toxicity, who's going to be bearing the brunt of that development. And I'm interested in that environmental movement, but not my environmental politics cannot come at a cost of exporting those industries abroad, which I think is what we have done for many, many years. And that international perspective has to come in our analysis. And so in many ways, we consume things here in Quebec, we consume things in Canada. Perhaps we should produce some of it, but how do we produce it? And where do we put it? These are the questions I'm interested in having at this particular moment where we are all very excited, apparently, about the energy transition. For some promises are supposed to happen in 2025. That's 2 years from now. It's extremely fast. It's happening incredibly rapidly. And so we need all hands on deck, and we should be asking questions.
Thank you very much for asking those questions. My guest today was Cynthia Morinville. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@humanityintheloop.com.
Thanks for listening to the Humanity in the Loop podcast. The opinions expressed by the host and guests of this podcast are their own and do not reflect those of their employer or any other affiliation. Humanity is not automatic.